As we have pointed out, I'm going to talk a bit about some of the most interesting results from this year's ranking. I'm sure everyone who's really excited has already looked at the results online this morning and seen where you rank. So I'm going to try and focus more on some of the trends we've seen, some of the patterns over the 6 editions now where we've been creating this ranking. I just wanted to step back a little bit and explain a little bit of background of QS. So this is our founder, Nunzio Quacquarelli, who established the company in 1990. Since the founding of the company, the mission of QS was to enable motivated people from around the world to fulfill their potential by fostering international mobility, educational achievement, and career development. So why am I telling you this? This is something that's really important to keep in the back of your mind when you're looking at what the methodology is behind our ranking and why we do this. So following on from QS's foundational mission, our rankings were designed with prospective students in mind, and specifically prospective international students. We also have many other audiences that consume our rankings. You can see many of them here. So academics, prospective partners, scholarship providers, current students, employers, university leaders, governments, and alumni. But it is important to remember that this central consumer, the prospective students, is what everything's designed around. So bearing that in mind, what do we believe makes up a world-class university? There's 4 key pillars that I and my team believe really are important for classifying a world-class university. The first pillar is research, teaching, employability, and having an international perspective on things. Employability is something that's a unique lens for QS. It's something that QS looks at in a lot more depth than any other ranking provider. And bearing in mind that the ranking is designed for prospective students, this is the main reason most of them are going to university. The other point that often comes under scrutiny when I talk about this schema is the internationalization pillar, and especially in the emerging Europe and Central Asia region. I've talked to a lot of universities who have complained that this isn't fair in their context, that they feel their role is to produce graduates for their local job markets, not for the rest of the world. And while I think that's important, I just wanted to share a little bit of a personal story about why I don't think that's a good way of thinking. So this is my grandparents. This is Janis, and in the middle here is Velta, so my grandfather, my grandmother. So they grew up in Western Latvia, not far from here, a couple of 100 kilometers away. And when they became young adults, they traveled to Riga. My grandmother became a nurse. She trained as a nurse, and my grandfather trained as an engineer. Like many people from the Baltic, they lived through some quite difficult times of the period, through the Second World War, and they chose to leave the country. They fled through Western Europe, becoming refugees, first in a refugee camp in Germany, then going down through Italy and finding their way to Australia, which is where I was born. So when they got to Australia, this is them later in life, they had quite good qualifications from Latvia, but they weren't recognized there. Nobody had ever heard of these places they were educated in, the workplace training they had done. So it sort of was irrelevant. I mean, both of them. So my grandmother ended up having to work in a laundry of a mental health hospital. My grandfather ended up working for an airline, cleaning airplanes. So, they really weren't making the use of those skills that they had. But this is why I think the internationalization pillar of our schema is so important, because whether people like it or not, the skills do need to be transferable to other contexts. And I think when you look at this situation, it is a bit of an extreme circumstance, really. However, looking at the current world, people are a lot more mobile, young people especially, a lot more mobile, and they need to know that they can take those qualifications with them wherever they may find themselves in the world. So I'm just going to move on to some more boring stuff now instead of the personal stories. So this is QS's methodology for the Emerging Europe and Central Asia, or EECA, ranking. It's structured around these 8 areas, which do link into that sort of 4-tiered schema I was talking about before. So the first area we look at is academic reputation. That makes up 30% of the overall ranking score. We look at employer reputation, which makes up 20% of the score. Research makes up 15% of the score. And then we have 2 indicators, the faculty-student ratio and staff with PhD indicators, which are essentially working as proxies for teaching. They're not ideal metrics, but they do give some sort of indication of what the student experience may be like. They make up 15% collectively of the overall score. And then we look at 3 different internationalization metrics. The first one, making up 10%, is International Research Network. Web impact makes up 10%. And then international staff and students, 5%. And I'll go into a bit more detail about some of these areas shortly. So the first indicator, the academic reputation indicator, this is formed from a survey that QS runs called the Global Academic Survey, which is the largest survey of its kind in the world. So what we do is ask academics around the world to nominate which universities they feel are the best in their field of expertise. So if, for example, you're a history professor, we will ask you to nominate which other universities you think are the best at history. This year we considered 95,000 respondents who made 1.5 million different nominations for universities. And in those nominations, there was nearly 5,000 different universities mentioned. So it is a ridiculously big sample size. When we're running the analysis, we do consider responses from the past 5-year period, but giving more weighting to the most recent 3 years. So it is quite contemporary in that way. Then we have the employer reputation indicator, which is a similar story. We run a survey where we ask employers to nominate which universities they feel are the best in their in preparing graduates for the workplace. So this year we considered 45,000 employer responses. There was 240,000 different nominations made with 4,300 universities named. Like with the academic survey, we consider responses from a 5-year period, and we do give more weighting to the more recent ones. Research. So with research, we look at 2 different areas. So we look at the number of papers per faculty area with a weighting of 10% of the overall score. And then we look at citations per paper which is 5% of the overall score. So here we're trying to incentivize publishing more papers as well as publishing quality papers. All this data is sourced from Elsevier's Scopus database. We consider papers over a 5-year period. So in this case, it was from 2013, papers published from 2013 to 2017. And then for the citations, we look at a period of 2013 to 2018, an extra year there, because obviously it takes time for a paper to get cited. So the next indicator area I wanted to talk about is the International Research Network indicator. Actually, I might just switch microphones here so I can go for a little walk. Okay, I think you can all hear me now. So with the International Research Indicator, this makes up 15% of the ranking's overall score. Again, it's something we source from Scopus's Elsevier database. And what it does is focuses on the diversity of international research collaborations. So we do look at the number of collaborations, and when I talk about the diversity, I'm talking about the diversity of different countries that are being collaborated with. The way we do the calculation, it does provide more emphasis on the diversity rather than the number of collaborations, although both are considered. We use a calculation method called the Margalef Index, which is something that we've drawn from the environmental sciences. It's a method that's typically used to calculate the ecodiversity of different environments, but we thought it transferred quite well to this context, and it does tell some interesting stories. And we only consider collaborations where there have been 3 collaborations with the same partner over the last 5 years, and that's 3 collaborations in that faculty area as well. So it is quite a high threshold, but we feel that gives an indication that there is some sort of genuine ongoing collaboration taking place rather than a once-off joint publication. So then there's a whole series of points where we ask people like you to directly submit data to QS. So we look at the faculty-student ratio, which makes up 10% of the overall score. And here we're looking at full-time equivalent numbers. 5% of the weighting goes to staff with PhD. We look at the percentage of staff with a PhD in the institution or an equivalent terminal degree, because we realize in some contexts they're called slightly different things. 2.5% of the overall weight goes to the percentage of international faculty, so that's the percentage of faculty coming from countries other than where the institution is based, and 2.5% for international students. So then we have the Web Impact indicator. Web Impact makes up 10% of the overall ranking score. I missed it off the slide here. This is something we draw from the Webometrics ranking of universities. However, what we do with this is seek to assess the effectiveness with which institutions are sharing their story with the rest of the world about what they do. Thinking about this international recognition, if no one's ever heard of you, how would they know that your graduates are any good, for instance? We do take the webometrics ranking, however, we refactor it slightly to remove the research indicators that fall under that, so they're not duplicating the other things we're doing. So, as Zoya mentioned, this year we have created our largest ranking of institutions across the EECA region. There's 350 institutions featuring. That compares with 100 in our first edition. We'd like to grow this even further. The only reason we haven't so far is because of an issue around data availability, but it seems across the region more and more data is becoming available over time. So I'm sure everyone wants to know who came out top this year. With the top 10 institutions, there's actually been quite a degree of stability from last year's results, but there are some interesting observations I can draw from this. So the Moscow State University remains the #1 institution in the region again this year. In second place was St. Petersburg State University, which actually climbed up from 4th place 2 years ago, so there's a little bit of a shift there. One thing to bear in mind is at the top of this rankings table, and pretty much any rankings table we create, it's so minuscule, the difference between institutions, that these types of shifts don't really tell you a great deal about changes in the institution. Third place is Novosibirsk State University, which slipped down to 3rd place. Of course, when someone comes up, someone else is going to slip down. And then the top university, which is the top university to feature outside of Russia this year, is Tartu University from Estonia. And they came in 4th place, which was a movement of 1 place from last year. However, still a little bit short of the 3rd place they held in 2018. In 5th is Charles University from the Czech Republic, which slipped slightly this year. 6th, Jagiellonian University from Poland, and please do laugh at my pronunciation if you wish. Tomsk State University in 8th, Czech Technical University in Prague 9th, and Masaryk University from Czech Republic in 10th. So moving on, I and my team have been running a bit of analysis around these rankings to try and detect some of the trends now that it's been operating for a few years. So this chart shows the effect of combining the different indicators together. So the top institution in employer academic reputation is Moscow State University, which ranks #1 overall. But when we look at some of the other indicators, you do see some interesting stories. So in the faculty-student ratio, there was actually 9 institutions that achieved the top possible score. The average overall ranking of the top institutions in this indicator was actually 98th place overall. So even though they have got very high faculty-student ratios, overall they're not ranking right at the top of the table. In the staff with PhD indicator, there's a similar story. There was actually 34 institutions that achieved the top score, and the overall rank of those was 114th place. Jumping on to the International Research Network indicator, this is a challenging indicator I was talking about before. The top scoring institution was Charles University with an overall ranking of 5th place. So it wasn't right at the top, but up there in this case. In the Web Impact Indicator, there was 5 institutions that achieved the maximum score with an average rank between them of 10th place. So these were Moscow State University, Charles University, University of Warsaw, Masaryk University, and University of Ljubljana. So I just wanted to have a little look at some of the different patterns from country to country in recent years. So you can see here performance of Russian universities has remained fairly stable. So this looks at the top 100 institutions in the ranking. So there has consistently been 23 or thereabouts Russian universities in the top 100. Poland has been on the rise. There's 14 institutions now represented in the top 100. With Turkey, you can see there's been actually quite a bit of fluctuation. So there's now 12 institutions in the top 100. There was 13 at one point. Kazakhstan has not been showing such a positive story, I'm afraid, which I'm sure will disappoint a number of people here. There has been a decline in the number of top 100 institutions. So 5 years ago, there was 8 institutions. Now there's, I can't quite read the slide from there. There's 4 institutions. So I thought I'd have a bit of a look at the International Research Indicator, International Research Network Indicator, because so many people here have been asking me for more information about this. So on average, Polish, Slovak, and Czech institutions have been scoring the highest in this indicator, on average, that is. So that's with scores of 74, 70, and 67, respectively. These scores are out of 100. If we just look at the top 5 institutions in each country, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Russia are actually showing the strongest profiles, and that's represented by those orange lines. If we look at the top 20 institutions in the International Research Network Indicator, you can see that Charles University comes out first, University of Zagreb, University of Ljubljana, University of Belgrade, and Moscow State University make up the top 5. Of the top institutions, the Czech University of Life Sciences in Prague, Hacettepe University in Turkey, University of Maribor, and Teltech are all showing the quickest, fastest movements from the previous year. Just moving on to the Web Impact Indicator, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia are showing the overall strongest scores in this indicator. And when you consider only the top 5 institutions again, the Czech Republic, Russia, and Turkey actually show the strongest profiles. Looking at who came out top in that indicator, this is a list of the top 20. I'm sorry, it's probably quite hard for people at the back of the room to see. We have Moscow State University coming out first, followed by Charles University and Massachusetts University. And among the top 20 institutions, the biggest movers this year were actually Belarus State University, University of Szeged, and Middle East Technical University. So they've come into the top 20 and in quite a rapid form there. With the Web Impact Indicator, this is generally based around the websites and so forth, so it may be worth looking at what has changed with these institutions if you're trying to sort of understand your own strategy of what you could do about this. So we saw quite a rapid growth in the size of the ranking this year. We had over 50 new entrants enter, and here you can see a bit of a distribution of where they are. For the first time, we've had institutions from Albania and Uzbekistan enter the ranking as well, which is very exciting. So I thought I might move along to comparing a couple of different countries that, at least in my mind, I would see as historic competitors in the context of this ranking. So I'm going to start off, since we're here in Lithuania, talking about the Baltic states and how they compare to one another. Just stepping back to this, the number of the performance of many of the institutions in the Baltic states has actually been pretty consistent over time. Here we look at the different countries across the different indicators. So this is average scores that those countries are receiving. There are a few different representations of those. So Lithuania is shown in the purple color, in the sort of reddy maroon color of the Latvian flag, perhaps, sort of like my socks actually, is Latvia, and Estonia in the more yellow color. So you can see in looking at these representations that across the three countries, with the exception of Estonia, the staff with PhD indicator is actually quite strong. Latvia and Lithuania seem to compare quite similarly on the employer and academic reputation indicators, but Estonia is outperforming them on average by far in those. Same goes with the web impact. So a positive story compared to the others in the region is the International Students Indicator for Latvia. For Estonia, international faculty, international research network and papers per faculty are quite strong. And for Lithuania, again, that staff with PhD really is a strong point for them. Here we look at those different indicators and what the changes have been over time. One thing to bear in mind here is there have been new institutions coming onto the radar for this ranking each year. So some of the changes may just be attributed to those new players. Across all the countries, most of the performance has actually been either pretty stable or some slight downward trends. However, when you do look at the overall ranking, Lithuania actually shows a bit of an upward trajectory, which is quite a positive story. Staff with PhD has been a bit of a downward slide for everyone across the region. And with the reputation indicators, it really has been pretty stable. I mean, Latvia, perhaps, the last couple of years has picked up a bit from where it was in about 4 years ago. But other than that, there's not really much to report. Looking at the different institutions across the three countries, this looks at the changes in the last 3 years. So things have been really stable, especially with the top institutions. With the lower ranked ones, sometimes such large swings look quite scary, but it can just be because there was new institutions coming into the ranking that displaced them quite a lot. In terms of positive stories, our hosts here, actually, you've seen them sort of rise up the ranking a little bit from previous years, whereas lower down you've seen a few slips in the ranking. Rita Strudens University, for instance, has slipped quite a few places from where it was, and so have some of the others down the bottom of the table there. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about Lithuania, since this is where we are at the moment. So there's 8 Lithuanian institutions in the ranking, which is the same for the last 3 years. So these are the numbers down the bottom here. And the best overall rank for a Lithuanian institution is 18th place this year. It was 17th last year, so not really much of a change there. Looking at the average scores a little bit in a bit more detail. Here we're comparing the averages for Lithuania to the averages across the whole region. So the middle yellow line across these charts is the average for the whole EECA region. So when you look at this, actually, there's quite a positive story to tell with across a lot of the indicator areas. International faculty is an area that I would say is something that probably needs to be considered, whether there's an issue there. But otherwise, there are quite good positive trends across the academic and employer reputation indicators, as well as many of the others. The international students indicator has shown huge growth, which is, I think, says something about the internationalization that's really taking place in the country. Here's a list of the top institutions from Lithuania, and we just talked about that a little bit, so I'm not going to go into too much detail again. And here we look at who the top performers are in each of the different indicators. One thing that you do notice with this is there's actually quite a bit of diversity when you look at the different indicators. Some of the sort of historic traditional names, such as Vilnius University, are coming up there in the reputation indicators quite strongly. But across the other areas, you do see quite a few different names mentioned, which is, really says something about the diversity of players in the market, I think. So the next set of countries I wanted to compare are Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. Why these three countries, you might ask? I think they're all of somewhat comparative size. They're neighbours to each other. They have a similar number of universities in the rankings and are geographically close together. You see quite similar average performances across some of the countries here. So Poland is shown in the purple on these charts. In that burgundy reddy colour is Czech Republic, and Hungary in the more yellow colour. So you can see actually when you look at this spider chart that Poland and Hungary actually across a lot of the indicators are very similar, performing very similar. You see a quite similar shape there, whereas the Czech Republic is showing slightly differently. So when you do look at where the Czech Republic's performing better than the other two countries is the international faculty, international students. So I think it does tell you a bit of a story about how international their higher education system is compared to the others. Here we compare the three countries across the different indicators. So these are the average scores once again. And unlike with the Baltic countries, I think there are a few more trends visible here. Staff with PhD and international students have actually been slipping for a number of countries. So in Hungary, staff with PhD has taken a bit of a dive, actually. And in Poland, the international student numbers have been slipping quite a lot as well. Same with international faculty in both Poland and Hungary, which may be a symptom of some of the sort of bigger political issues that have been going on in the countries, perhaps. The next three countries I wanted to talk about, which we don't talk about a lot actually in this context, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. So Georgia has 2 institutions in the ranking, Armenia 3, and Azerbaijan 5. When you compare these countries, you can see their profiles are actually quite different from one another, unlike the other sets of countries I've been comparing. So Georgia is represented in the purple color, Armenia in that reddy color, and Azerbaijan in the yellow color. Across the reputation indicators, across the faculty-student ratio indicator and staff with PhD indicator, Georgia is performing quite well. When you look at Armenia, actually where they're performing the best is probably the international students and web impact indicators, as well as the research indicators, so the papers per faculty and citations per paper indicators. Whereas for Azerbaijan, the international faculty is actually the strongest area. Looking at the trends over time, with some of these lines you can see they've only been on the chart for a year or two, so that means they haven't been part of the ranking before that. There are downward trends across a lot of these countries. I think there are some positive stories there too, though. Georgia's academic reputation has actually increased slightly, as has the employer reputation. But for Azerbaijan in particular, there does seem to be a real downward trend emerging, actually across a lot of these indicator areas. One thing to remember is that doesn't mean the universities there are necessarily getting worse. It's probably that everyone else around them is getting better at a faster pace. And looking in these countries, these are the top performing institutions. Unlike the other countries we've looked at, you can see quite a few rapid movements in these cases. Again, that's because these institutions are coming a lot lower down in the table and likely to be displaced by new players on the scene. So I'm going to look at a few domestic comparisons now between some of the larger countries that feature in the ranking. So starting off with Russia. In the first edition of the ranking, there was 26 Russian institutions that featured. Now there are 105 institutions. The best overall rank the whole time has been number one from Moscow State. Here we look at the top institutions in Russia. You can see, I suppose in second and third place, there's a bit of rivalry there with St. Petersburg State and Novosibirsk displacing one another from year to year. Otherwise, it's actually really quite stable. A few other movements a little further down. HSE, for instance, has shown a positive trajectory over the last couple of years, as is Tomsk Polytechnic. Here are the top 5 in each of the different indicators in Russia. When I looked at this list, one thing that, again, was quite striking for me or jumped out was that there is actually quite good diversity when you look at those lists. Of course, Moscow State dominates a lot of those, but there are a number of different institutions who are featuring quite well in the different indicator areas. The ones in grey here, if anyone's interested, are institutions that we evaluated but didn't make it into the final list of the ranking, but scored well in that indicator area. So next I want to look at Kazakhstan. In the first edition there was 8 institutions, now there's 24 institutions. The top ranked institution in Kazakhstan, which is represented by this yellow line, you can see quite a bit of fluctuation from year to year compared to some of the other examples we've looked at. So it was a peak of 10th place in the 2018 edition of the ranking, down to 18th place today. Looking at the top institutions in the country, The top 5 haven't shifted at all in the last 3 years in terms of their performance relative to one another. And then we just see some minor changes further down, not a great deal of difference. And here we look at the top 5 institutions in each of the indicator areas in Kazakhstan. So you can see KazNU performing quite well across the reputation indicators, staff with PhD, faculty student indicators. But again, we are seeing some diversity across the other indicators, which is really positive. And then Ukraine, which is another country that features quite a large number of institutions in the ranking. There were 6 Ukrainian institutions in the first edition. Now there's 20. The top ranked institution in the country, there has been a bit of movement over time. Down from 39th place was the highest ranking in the 2015-16 edition of the ranking. And in the current edition, 29th place is where the highest institution ranks. So there's a really positive story there. Here are the top institutions in Ukraine. The National University of Kiev has held its place pretty strong relative to the other Ukrainian institutions. And then you can see below that a little bit of juggling of positions that's taken place. And again, down the bottom of the table, actually, there are some quite more rapid changes. And here are the top 5 institutions from Ukraine. So one thing that is quite visible here, again, is that there are quite different lists in each indicator. And unlike in some of the indicators, the top institution is actually not leading so many lists. And then Turkey is another big country in this ranking. So there was 10 Turkish institutions in the first edition, now there's 51. The top ranked institution has shown some changes in places. So 11th place in the current ranking, up from a peak of 7th at one point. Even though when you look at that yellow line, it looks like a pretty rapid change. We're only talking about a couple of places each year, to be honest. So here, looking at the top universities, Koç University in 11th place this year, seen year-on-year rises in the last 3 years. Before that, though, there were some other more fluctuating trends evident. Middle East Technical University has actually slipped slightly this year, and most of the movements there are pretty small. So here we look at the top 5 Turkish institutions across each of the indicator areas. In this case, you can see Middle East Technical University actually is performing quite strongly, coming in first place across the academic, employer reputation, papers per faculty indicator. So that's the details of what I was going to talk about. So before we move on to any questions anyone may have, I was quite excited to hear that our first ever Uzbek university to enter the ranking was here with us today. So this is Tiami University from Tashkent, and I would actually like to invite them on stage here to share a little bit about their story and to congratulate them in entering the ranking for the first time.
On behalf of QS, I'd like to present you with this certificate. We normally don't do this, but for the last 3 years, it's been such a big deal in Uzbekistan. Actually, no more, 2 years, right? Now, and the ministry and the government are doing, well, they're doing a lot of different things. Some of the ministries could probably learn the initiatives, but I'm really pleased to have the first ever Uzbek university to enter the rankings and to participate in our event. And I hope, I've already texted the minister because he was asking, so how we do? I was like, okay, it's announced, it's happening. So well done, and when you get home, there will be quite a few media journalists waiting for you, for your comments. So please, if you want to have a couple of words.
Thank you so much. Большое спасибо коллегам, большое спасибо команде QS, которая очень нам помогла. Ну, не у всех наушники. Узбекистан является самой крупной по населению страной в Центральной Азии.
Uzbekistan is the biggest populous country in the Central Asia.
Поэтому, выражаясь словами Зои Зайцевой, раз мы ввязались в эту игру, мы только начинаем эту игру играть.
As Zoya mentioned, that if we started to play in this ranking system, we try to do the best.
Мы всего где-то около 2 лет начали работать с международными рейтинговыми компаниями.
Only 2 years we started to work with these international ranking companies.
Не буду называть причины, это, наверное, многим известно.
He would like to give some explanation about this, why we are late coming.
Но хочу назвать только одну цифру. Ежегодно у нас заканчивают школы и лицеи и поступают в вузы около 1 миллиона молодых людей.
He would like to only mention that every year in our the schools and 1 million young people come in.
Поэтому за 2 года количество вузов с 57 сейчас увеличилось до 110.
That's why for the 2 years, during the 2 years, we increased the number of the higher educational institutions from the 57 to 110.
Поэтому нам есть где работать. Не хочу много говорить. Еще раз спасибо всем. Спасибо команде Кейт, спасибо Зое. Мы вот за последние очень интенсивно работаем, за последние 1,5-2 года. И надеюсь, в следующих анализах, ранкингах, годовых рейтингов будут сравнивать уже несколько вузов с Узбекистана. Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much for your attention, and we would like to thank you, Zoya. Thank you, QS, for this great support to our universities, and we believe that in the near future we will have more institutions from Uzbekistan. Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you. Congratulations.
"19 areas of study, 23 master degree directions, 12 specialties, 7 faculties, academic TMA. From science and engineering to organization and management. Scientific discoveries and practical applications. Exploring new intellectual frontiers and attack important societal problems. Research TMA. Opening the door to the world. worldwide partnerships with prestigious organizations. Global TMA.
난 TMA는 세바만.
I love TMA.
여러분 TMA.
저는 TMA를 사랑합니다.
난 TMA는 역시 그라만.
我喜欢 TMA.
The source of creative energy shaping the world of the future. Youth TMA. Water is the basis of life. Knowledge is the basis of prosperity. We love TMA! Tashkent Institute of Irrigation and Agricultural Mechanization Engineers.
Okay, I bet everyone's getting hungry now. I know I am. But does anyone have any urgent questions they wanted to ask me before we wrap up for lunch?
One simple question: is the area getting better or slipping with respect to the world?
This is a very good question. I think I need to do a little bit more analysis to answer this fully. But my instinct is telling me that it is actually getting better. I think broadly across the region, I think institutions are becoming more international. They're having increased emphasis on using data to improve their performance and so forth. And I think, this is a really positive thing. Compared to some other regions of the world, absolutely, I would say things are moving quicker in this area than they are in others.
I think I might add to this answer that if we look at the universities from the EECA ranking and check how they perform in the world university ranking, overall, there is quite a gap between those in top 300 and those below 500. So below 500, there is slightly more dynamic. We have more new entries, and it's also, as we all know, it's a bit easier to move from, bottom to the middle, and then the higher you get, the thicker the competition gets. But the key challenging indicators remain the same, unfortunately. So citation index isn't getting much better for the whole of region. Some institutions, some selected universities, yes, they improve, but I wouldn't say that's something which is a positive trend overall. And also it's important to remember that out of 350 universities in EECA ranking, only about 170 or 180 are in the world ranking. So not all EECA universities are in the global ranking yet. And also the academic reputation, even though the database of experts familiar with the region grows, overall it's usually the leaders who improve, but the universities in the middle and below take a bit more time to improve their results and academic reputation. And if I may, on this note, I would strongly encourage all of you here to talk again to your faculty members, to talk to the international associations where you're members of, and help us build a database of experts familiar with the region, because we've got lots of North American experts, we've got lots of experts from Western Europe, but how many of them actually know you? How many of them work with Eastern European, Central Asian, ex-USSR universities? So it's not so much that, our database is biased, it's just not everyone in our database is familiar with the region. And here it's down to you whether we're able to have these experts or not. But overall, the number of universities is definitely growing from the region in the global ranking. So this is a positive one. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, compared to some of the other regions we look at, so compared to Latin America, for instance, I think we're definitely observing a much, much faster sort of shift to this real data-centric way of operating.
Спасибо большое, очень интересная информация, очень свежайшая. И у меня вопрос такой. данные, которые рейтинга от Восточной Европы и Центральной Азии, они, ну, этого региона точно, не совсем коррелируют с теми данными, которые мирового рейтинга. Ну, я думаю, что вы это прекрасно знаете. Вот и вопрос такой, с чем это связано, почему так делается? Есть ли здесь какой-то, ну, будем говорить так, какой-то скрытый смысл? Или это просто из-за того, что какая-то просто взята другая методика? В чем дело?
This question is asking why there are differences between the positions of institutions within certain countries, for instance, in the world university rankings versus this ranking. And the simple answer to that is the methodologies are slightly different. If you apply a different framework to a situation, of course, it's going to have different results. So I don't really have any specifics with me to sort of explain it in particular cases right now, but we can look into that further. But it will be because of a completely different set of indicators.
Я прошу прощения, просто продолжу. Понятно, что методология там где-то меняется. Но вопрос такой, зачем это делать? В чем здесь идея? То есть для чего это все делается в данной ситуации, если есть одна методология, которая есть для мирового рейтинга, и когда уже идет региональная, здесь она как-то улучшает, углубляет или просто выводит вперед какое-то направление. В чем вот идеология? Понятно, что методология разная, раз не коррелирует. Спасибо.
Yeah, that's actually a quite good point. It's like why you apply different methodologies to different circumstances. One thing I think with this regional ranking, and actually all of our other regional rankings, we really wanted to emphasize was a greater focus on this internationalization area, which has been a challenge for universities in the region. So looking at things like web impact, for instance, this is one of the reasons we introduced that. We would like to introduce some of these things into the World University ranking. However, we do find as soon as you have universities from English-speaking countries, it automatically throws bias in when you put some of these indicators into the mix. And so I suppose that's the reason why a lot of these indicators you don't see in the World University rankings, because we don't want to artificially benefit institutions from English-speaking countries.
Я прошу прощения, еще один момент. Просто будем говорить так. Вот есть рейтинг главный, да, мировой рейтинг. Теперь мы, когда говорим рейтинг там по регионам, то если вы говорите, что здесь мы уже берем другую методологию, тогда мы должны этот рейтинг, наверное, называть уже не просто рейтинг по регионам, а рейтинг по регионам с акцентом на что-то. То есть на интернационализацию, как вы сказали, или там на исследования, я не знаю. Но понимаете, какая ситуация? Когда мы делаем рейтинг глобальный, а потом из него как бы берем, просто срезаем рейтинг региональный, и вот этот рейтинг и тот рейтинг, который сегодня объявляется, он не коррелирует. И вот здесь теперь вопрос такой, зачем тогда нужен такой рейтинг?
If I may, I'll answer this question because originally back in 2012, just to give a bit of a history of how this ranking actually appeared, why we started producing it, because that was in 2012, quite a few ministries of education, quite a few governments, Russia, for example, and Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan in particular, they've started looking into how to make their education more competitive. And separately, 3 individual ministers of education came to us and asked me to come up with something that will help them highlight the educational institutions from their country, not necessarily universities, because there are some academies, there are academics which are focused on some particular subject. So when we were looking at the region, it was clear that indicators used in the global world university rankings won't really support the still good but not strong enough on an international level universities. So we couldn't apply the same indicators simply for the reason that it will be, as you said, just an extract from the world university rank. We don't do extracts. We prefer to develop a methodology that reflects the strengths of a particular region. So if you check the methodology for the Latin America or for the Asian universities, you'll see that it differs. And yes, there are some similarities, but also each methodology is tailored to highlight the strengths of a particular systems. Now, you're saying it's confusing. I actually don't think it's confusing. I think it's encouraging. Because if there are universities who don't really have like strong research power or not that many international collaborations, but they're doing a good job supplying local economy with talented young professionals, it doesn't mean we have to take them out of equation. It doesn't mean that we can't still assess them and bring them to the spotlight and show and tell the world about them. So the whole point of actually slightly different indicators was to highlight the strengths of local universities, something that we can't do on a global level. Now, these days, we have even worse case studies when we have governments of individual countries coming to us and saying, hey, QS, you're doing great international rankings. How about you do a national ranking? And for many, many years, we've been saying no to such suggestions and requests, but when was it? 2 years now? Yeah, a couple of years we've been running individual country-specific rankings. India, China, who else we have?
India, China,
Japan, Korea. I have to say, Russia came asking for the same, and I said no. Because I don't think we are in a position to deliver an insightful, objective, and accurate information on a national level to a country with that many institutions, with a complicated political agenda, educational political agenda. So there are plenty of Russian companies who can do those rankings. I'd rather we stick to the regional subjects and international ones. So that's our position as of now. It might change in a couple of years, but for now, I believe that regional rankings are needed for not that competitive on international level universities to help them, tell the world about their successes. And if it's confusing, it means we're not doing our job with the journalists well enough. So I'm happy to discuss how we can work it better in Kazakhstan.
Just to add one more little layer to that, at the start of my presentation, I talked about our rankings being for students, prospective international students. We've run research with students all around the world, and in different areas, obviously they have different priorities, and we tried to focus this ranking when we were designing the methodology on the things Zoya was talking about, but also keeping this in mind, what students who are wanting to study in that region have been telling us they want. So that's one of the other reasons behind that. We're eating into the lunch break now, so if anyone else has any questions, please come and see me over lunch. I'm more than happy to talk about this more. So we're going to be coming back at 2 p.m, so 1400 after lunch. We'll have a session from Yulia, actually, from VMU, who's going to be talking about rankings and webometrics. And CRIS as a tool for enhancing visibility. We're going to have Anna from Rudin, who's going to talk about subject strengths in their case. And we're going to have Iiro, who is from Estonia, talking about some of the national branding do's and don'ts that he's found in his context, as well as Zoya coming back later in the day to talk about branding and how you can really make the most of your situation. So enjoy your lunch and thank you.